Welcome to Crime and Justice Channel, where we dive deep into the most chilling and mysterious true crime stories. Whether it's shocking murders, unsolved mysteries, or gripping investigations, we bring it all to you. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really goes a long way in supporting the channel. Now let's dive into the story for today. Imagine being in your home, enjoying the warmth and love of your family on a Tuesday night with the house filled with laughter and the feeling that everything is just as it should be. But then, imagine waking up the next morning and stepping into a nightmare. The people you loved most, your parents, lifeless on the floor. Shot dead by the one person you trusted above all else, your own brother. How do you even begin to comprehend such horror? This is the shocking story of the Sitton family massacre. A senseless crime that rocked a community and shattered a family forever. Muriel and Jimmy Sitton were pillars of their community in Houston, Texas. They were well-respected and well-loved. Two people who had devoted their lives to helping others. Jimmy was a high school teacher with a passion for inspiring his students. His patience and warmth made him a favorite among both his colleagues and the students he mentored. Muriel, his wife, was a nurse known for her compassionate care. She touched the lives of everyone she met, always putting others first, whether they were her patients or her family. Together, they raised two children, Nick Sitton and his sibling, within a home full of love, laughter, and warmth. To the outside world, they were the picture of the perfect family. Their home was a place where everyone felt welcome, a place where love and support were always present. The Sittons were a family you would want to be a part of. A family everyone admired. Muriel, with her bright smile and caring nature, was the emotional glue that held her family together. Her love for her children was unconditional, and her devotion to her husband unwavering. Jimmy, though busy with work, was always present for his family. He cheered at his children's events, helped them with their schoolwork, and made sure they never lacked for anything, emotionally or physically. Their two children, particularly their son Nick, had grown up in a home where family meant everything. Nick was always seen as a strong, healthy child, and his parents poured love into him. But as time went on, the cracks began to show, unnoticed by the people around him. Nick Sitton, the seemingly devoted son, had been battling with dark personal struggles for years. Beneath the surface of a loving family, Nick's life had taken a downward spiral, one that would culminate in violence. Nick's struggles with substance abuse had been well documented. His addiction to methamphetamine had begun in his teenage years, and by the time he was an adult, it was clear that his life was spinning out of control. He had made several attempts to seek help, rehabilitation programs and therapy, but his addiction would not let him go. He pushed people away, including his family. Jimmy and Muriel had tried to intervene. They tried everything they could, offering support, enrolling him in rehabilitation, and giving him chances to turn his life around. But Nick resisted. He grew increasingly resentful of his parents, viewing their attempts to help him as a form of control rather than love. The tension between Nick and his parents grew with each passing day. His addiction deepened, and his financial troubles mounted. But it wasn't just about the drugs. Nick's psychological state deteriorated as well. His self-destructive tendencies began to clash with his parents' desire to help him. He had always been a quiet and introverted boy, but now, Nick seemed to lash out at anyone who tried to get close. The love he once shared with his parents was replaced by anger, resentment, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The weeks leading up to the murders were marked by unusual behavior from Nick. Those close to the family had noticed the growing tension between him and his parents. There were arguments, moments of silence and withdrawal, and a growing sense that something was wrong in the Sitton home. But no one could have predicted the tragic end that was about to unfold. On the evening of December 8, 2015, everything appeared normal, at least on the surface. It was a Tuesday night, and the Sittons were planning to spend a quiet evening together after a stressful few months. Muriel and Jimmy hoped for a peaceful night after dealing with their son's increasing behavior problems. They were unaware that the night would turn into one of the most horrifying moments of their lives. Nick had been increasingly withdrawn in the days leading up to the tragedy. He seemed more agitated, more distant, and yet he remained within the family home. As the night wore on, an argument broke out, likely over Nick's ongoing addiction and his refusal to change. The tension had been building for months, and now, in the heat of the moment, it reached its breaking point. At around 10 p.m., the violence erupted. Nick, in a fit of rage, retrieved a handgun, a firearm that had been hidden away in the house, and shot Muriel Sitton in the head, killing her instantly. She never had the chance to defend herself. Next, Nick turned the gun on Jimmy Sitton, his father. Jimmy, too, was shot in the head without warning, without a chance to escape. The two people who had loved and cared for Nick throughout his life were gone in an instant. There was no struggle, no sign of a desperate attempt to stop what was happening. It was cold, calculated, and brutal. After murdering his parents, Nick didn't flee immediately. It's unclear exactly what he did in the moments following the killings. Whether he lingered in the house, overcome with rage, or whether he just silently fled the scene in disbelief. What we do know is that he left the house sometime between 10:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. The next morning, the unimaginable would unfold. Nick's sibling, who had been absent from the house that night, arrived home to find a scene of unimaginable horror. What should have been a normal morning of family life quickly turned into a nightmare. The sibling, shocked and disoriented, immediately called 911. As law enforcement arrived on the scene, they found the bodies of Muriel and Jimmy Sitton lying in pools of blood, in what was an eerily quiet and still house. The sheer horror of the situation left them stunned. No one could believe what had just transpired. The house, once filled with laughter and love, was now the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. As the first responders entered the Sitton family home, they were immediately struck by the brutal and methodical nature of the crime. The scene was nothing short of a nightmare. Two bodies, Muriel and Jimmy Sitton, lying lifeless in different parts of the house, each shot in the head, showing no signs of struggle or defense. Their home, once filled with warmth and love, had become the setting of a chilling tragedy. At first glance, it was clear that the crime was personal. Someone close to the victims had executed this act of violence with disturbing precision. The lack of forced entry, the absence of a struggle, and the sheer brutality of the killings pointed toward one unsettling possibility. The killer was someone the family knew well. The police immediately turned their attention to the Sitton family's son, Nick Sitton. His name had come up during initial interviews with neighbors and family members, who mentioned his recent emotional instability, substance abuse, and strained relationship with his parents. Nick had often been described as a quiet and reclusive young man, someone who had been battling addiction and emotional turmoil for years. It seemed only logical that he might be involved. But the question remained, why would he do such a thing? Nick's whereabouts after the killings were unclear for several hours. After fleeing the scene, he had gone into hiding, and law enforcement was unsure where he was. Forensic teams combed through the Sittons' home, collecting evidence, fingerprints, DNA samples, and a handgun, which was found near one of the bodies. These pieces of evidence pointed directly toward Nick, but without his immediate capture, they had no answers as to why he'd killed his parents. As law enforcement expanded their investigation, they began gathering information about Nick's background, his criminal history, his financial situation, and his relationship with his family. Nick had been involved in petty thefts and had even been arrested multiple times. But the Sittons had always tried to support him, hoping that their son would find a way to overcome his demons. But this support, in Nick's mind, had become a source of resentment. He saw it as a sign of their control over his life, a control he had been trying to break free from for years. His addiction to methamphetamine was a central aspect of his self-destruction. But it was the emotional and psychological toll of trying to keep up with the expectations of his parents that seemed to have triggered the violent outburst. As investigators began to dig deeper into Nick Sitton's psychological state, they began to see signs of mental instability that had likely contributed to his violent actions. Nick's anger management issues were well documented by friends and family, and his emotional volatility had worsened in recent months as his addiction spiraled further out of control. Psychological experts who later examined the case believed that Nick's unresolved emotional pain, combined with his addiction, played a significant role in his decision to kill his parents. His violent tendencies had been escalating for years, but the severe frustration he felt about his inability to control his life seemed to have reached a boiling point on that fateful evening. As the investigation continued, the search for Nick Sitton intensified. A manhunt was launched across Houston, with law enforcement working tirelessly to track down the fugitive. It didn't take long for police to start closing in on his whereabouts, but Nick had managed to hide out for several days, trying to evade capture. On December 14, 2015, 6 days after the killings, Nick Sitton was arrested in a nearby town. Law enforcement found him hiding in an abandoned house, attempting to lay low. He was arrested without incident, and authorities quickly transported him back to Houston to face charges. During questioning, Nick Sitton confessed to the murders of his parents. In his tearful confession, Nick admitted to shooting both of his parents after a heated argument, expressing remorse and anger at the same time. His words painted a picture of a man who was deeply conflicted, someone who had wanted to escape his reality but was also haunted by the consequences of his actions. Nick's confession revealed the inner turmoil he had been experiencing. He spoke about how he felt trapped in a life of addiction and failure, unable to live up to his parents' expectations. Muriel and Jimmy, in Nick's eyes, had become figures of authority he could no longer tolerate. Their constant efforts to intervene in his life, to help him overcome his addiction, became unbearable to him. In his confession, Nick also revealed that he had been planning the murder for days, building up the courage to follow through on his dark thoughts. The night of the killings, he had finally snapped, unable to control the rage and resentment that had been building inside him. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the motive behind the murders was not just the result of a single argument or frustration. Nick Sitton's mental health struggles, combined with the emotional weight of addiction, financial instability, and the pressure of meeting his parents' expectations, had created a perfect storm that led to the tragedy. Psychologists suggest that Nick's inability to cope with the demands placed on him, coupled with his addiction, created a sense of hopelessness that he couldn't escape. His parents' attempts to help him had become the primary source of his anger. In his disturbed state, Nick may have convinced himself that the only way to free himself from the torment of his own mind was to eliminate the people who were constantly reminding him of his failures. As investigators piece together the story of the Sitton family tragedy, they are left with more questions than answers. Could the murder of Muriel and Jimmy Sitton have been prevented? Was there something that could have been done to stop Nick before his anger and addiction led to this unthinkable violence? Nick Sitton's story is a painful reminder of the darkness that can grow inside when people suffer in silence, when mental illness and addiction go untreated and family interventions fall short. While Nick's remorse seems genuine, it does little to undo the damage caused by his actions. The aftermath of the Sitton family massacre left a devastating impact on everyone involved. The Sittons' extended family, friends, and community were left grappling with the unfathomable horror of the tragedy. The idea that a loving son could be responsible for the murder of his own parents sent shockwaves through the close-knit Houston community. For Nick's sibling, the emotional toll of not only losing their parents in such a violent way, but also realizing that their own brother was the one who took their lives was unimaginable. This sibling was left to deal with a tangled mess of grief, shock, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of loss. The siblings' life would never be the same. They would have to cope with the trauma of losing both parents and coming to terms with the fact that the violence was perpetrated by someone they had once loved and trusted. The Sittons' family members and neighbors were left in disbelief. How could someone as close as a son be capable of such a horrific crime? Jimmy and Muriel Sitton had been so well liked by everyone who knew them. The loss of such warm, kind-hearted people in the most brutal way possible seemed beyond comprehension. But the emotional devastation wasn't just confined to Nick's family. Law enforcement officers, too, were shaken by the brutal nature of the crime. The investigation had revealed that the Sittons had been loving, devoted parents, and yet their own son had turned on them. It was a case that left officers struggling to make sense of the senseless violence. Investigators and forensic experts knew the details of the crime, but the underlying questions, why? How could this happen? remained unanswered for those who had witnessed the aftermath. Nick Sitton's arrest was swift, but the legal proceedings would be anything but easy. On December 14, 2015, just days after the murder, Nick was taken into custody. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for killing both of his parents. His confession, while emotional, did little to lessen the gravity of the crime. The authorities were now tasked with determining whether Nick's mental health struggles and addiction would be a mitigating factor in his case. Nick's arrest was not only a personal tragedy for the Sitton family but also a legal dilemma. As his attorneys began preparing his defense, the primary question became whether Nick's mental health and substance abuse issues were sufficient grounds for a lesser charge or reduced sentence. Nick's psychological state was a major focal point in the case. His defense team argued that his actions were not premeditated, but rather the result of his addiction, mental instability, and years of emotional and psychological turmoil. But how much responsibility could be attributed to his mental health? Was his addiction and anger management the sole reason for his actions, or was there something deeper at play? Investigators continued to examine Nick's background, interviewing friends, family, and co-workers to try and pinpoint the exact factors that led him to commit such a brutal crime. As the case moved forward, the role of substance abuse and mental illness became central to the defense and prosecution. Nick's long-standing addiction to methamphetamine had clearly altered his psychological state. His defense team argued that his substance abuse had likely impaired his judgment and contributed significantly to the violent outburst. They also noted that Nick had been dealing with untreated mental health issues, including depression and anger management problems. Psychologists who assessed Nick suggested that his resentment toward his parents had been exacerbated by his addiction, and his inability to manage his emotions had likely caused him to lash out in a way that was both irrational and violent. Psychological experts also pointed out that Nick's deep feelings of failure, coupled with his inability to live up to his parents' expectations, might have contributed to a breakdown in his mental state, which led to the violence. Nick's actions were not those of a man in full control of his emotions or actions. His desperation, coupled with a complete lack of emotional support or healthy coping mechanisms, created a perfect storm of violence. On the other hand, the prosecution argued that Nick's crime was premeditated, that he had planned the killings in the days leading up to the attack. They pointed to the fact that he had retrieved a firearm and carried out the murders without hesitation. His actions, they claimed, were the result of deep anger and resentment toward his parents, not just the culmination of addiction or mental health issues. As the trial continued, the debate over Nick Sitton's culpability became heated. Could someone who had been battling addiction and mental health struggles truly be held fully responsible for the deaths of his parents? Or were his actions the result of forces beyond his control? Ultimately, Nick Sitton pled guilty to both murders, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Although Nick's defense team had hoped for a reduced sentence due to his mental health, the judge concluded that the severity of the crime outweighed any potential mitigating factors. The loss of Muriel and Jimmy Sitton was irreparable, and the impact of their deaths on their surviving child and the community was felt deeply. The sentence was a tragic end to a painful case. Nick Sitton, once the son of a family known for their love and devotion, was now facing the consequences of his actions. For the Sitton family's surviving members, particularly Nick's sibling, the road ahead was filled with grief and a deep sense of loss. They would never be able to understand why Nick had taken their parents' lives, and that emotional burden would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The Sitton family's close-knit community was forever changed by this tragedy. The news that Nick Sitton, a son, had murdered his own parents sent ripples through the area. It forced everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth. Addiction, mental health struggles, and family issues can destroy even the most seemingly perfect lives. The Sittons had been pillars of their community, and the loss of Jimmy and Muriel Sitton left a void that would never be filled. Their children were now forced to carry the weight of a tragic memory that would never fade. For Nick's sibling, the journey to healing seemed impossible. Not only had they lost both parents in the most horrific way imaginable, but the knowledge that their own brother was the killer would haunt them forever. How could they ever reconcile the person they had once loved with the man who had destroyed their family? The murder of Muriel and Jimmy Sitton left their surviving family members to face a trauma that most people could never even begin to imagine. For Nick's sibling, who had survived the massacre, the emotional burden was overwhelming. Not only had they lost both of their parents in the most brutal way, but the fact that the killer was their own brother added an entirely new layer of grief, anger, and betrayal. The surviving sibling was forced to grapple with the trauma of the murders, while also coming to terms with the complicated emotions they would forever associate with Nick. This survivor's grief was not just the loss of two parents, but the loss of the family dynamic as they had known it. The deep emotional scars left by this event were something they would likely carry for the rest of their lives. Over time, the survivor received support from mental health professionals, but recovery from something as tragic and complex as this is never straightforward. How could they ever heal from the thought that their own flesh and blood was responsible for such an atrocity? Could they ever reconcile their memories of the brother they once loved with the monster he became in the end? Many members of the extended Sitton family, including cousins, aunts, and uncles, were left to process their overwhelming grief while also managing the complex emotions surrounding Nick. While there was sympathy for Nick's struggles with addiction and mental health, there was no escaping the fact that he had brutally taken the lives of two people they all loved. This created a profound divide within the family. Some family members struggled to understand how Nick could have done such a thing, while others felt a deep sense of betrayal. As time went on, the surviving sibling faced another painful reality: the necessity of moving forward with their life. But how do you move forward when your entire world has been shattered in such an unimaginable way? How do you reconcile the loving memories of your parents with the violent crime that has permanently altered your existence? The community of Houston was also deeply affected by the tragic deaths of Muriel and Jimmy Sitton. The couple had been so well known and well liked that their loss was felt by many, not just those who had been closest to them. As members of the community came to grips with the fact that Nick was responsible for this horror, the shock of the crime reverberated far beyond just the Sitton family. The school where Jimmy Sitton had worked went into a period of mourning, as did the hospital where Muriel had worked. The couple had touched the lives of so many people over the years, and their sudden deaths left a massive void. In their honor, the community came together to hold vigils, donate to memorial funds, and support the surviving family members. Despite this support, the deep grief and confusion remained in the air, hanging over the community like a dark cloud. How could someone who had been so beloved by their neighbors and peers be taken from them in such a senseless way? Nick's arrest and subsequent conviction were not just a legal matter. They marked a collective tragedy for everyone who had known the Sittons. The community struggled with the idea of a son killing his parents, especially when those parents had been so beloved. It was a case that reminded everyone of the hidden darkness that sometimes lies behind closed doors. As the legal proceedings continued and Nick Sitton was sentenced to life in prison, several questions remained unanswered. While investigators could piece together what happened that night, the argument, the gun, Nick's confession, there were still lingering mysteries about why Nick had chosen to act the way he did. Could Nick's actions have been prevented? Had there been earlier interventions that could have helped Nick before his violence escalated to murder? Was there a missed opportunity for someone to notice the signs of his growing emotional instability, his depression, and his addiction before things spiraled out of control? Mental health professionals later expressed concerns that Nick had never received consistent care for his underlying mental health issues. Had his addiction and anger issues been addressed properly earlier in his life, could the tragedy have been avoided? What role did Nick's relationship with his parents play in the violence? Psychologists theorized that Nick's feelings of failure, exacerbated by his parents' efforts to help him, could have led him to resent them deeply. But what triggered the final breaking point? Was it one single argument that tipped him over the edge, or was it a culmination of months, if not years, of anger and frustration? Could Nick have been saved? The tragedy raised troubling questions about the long-term effects of untreated substance abuse and mental health issues. Could professional intervention have altered the course of Nick's life? Did his family's attempts to help him with tough love and support only drive him further away, making things worse rather than better? The case of Muriel and Jimmy Sitton is one of the most tragic examples of human complexity. The Sittons were ordinary people living an ordinary life, doing what they could to raise their children right. And yet, through a combination of emotional trauma, addiction, and mental instability, their family became the setting for one of the most devastating crimes imaginable. Nick Sitton's story serves as a powerful reminder of how mental health and addiction can silently chip away at a person's ability to cope, leading them to make decisions that seem impossible to understand. His anger, resentment, and emotional pain overwhelmed him, and tragically, he directed that violence toward the people who had always loved him. For the surviving family member, the road ahead will be long and filled with difficult questions. Can a person truly heal after such a betrayal? How does someone move forward after the violent death of both parents, and the realization that their own brother was responsible for it? The Sitton family massacre will forever remain a tragic reminder of the complex dynamics of family life, addiction, and mental health. As we reflect on this case, we are left to wonder, could this tragedy have been prevented? Could someone have seen the signs earlier, reached out to help, and altered the course of Nick's life? We may never have all the answers, but the story of Muriel and Jimmy Sitton is one that forces us to reflect on the delicate balance between love, control, and the weight of unresolved pain. If you have thoughts or theories about this case, we invite you to share them in the comments below. Do you believe Nick's actions could have been prevented? What do you think led to such a devastating crime? Let us know. If you found this story impactful, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another gripping true crime story. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes the darkest secrets are hidden in the places we least expect.